Go ahead, Christy.
Hi, good evening. So glad that you all could join us here for this evening discussion about war tax resistance hosted by the War Industry Resistors Network. My name is Chrissy Kirchhoffer, and I'm the outreach consultant with the National War Tax Resistance Coordinating Committee, who's a member organization of the War Industry Resistors Network. And so we're so grateful to have the opportunity tonight to talk about war tax resistance with Lincoln Rice and Carolyn Yoder tonight. Wanted to just give a little background that we've coordinated with the War Industry Resistor Network with Tax Day actions and Earth Day actions, and just so grateful to see this network alive and well and having these monthly webinars and to present. So we'll be going into war tax resistance as a way of resisting the war industry network, kind of in an individual and the work of the National War Tax Resistance Coordinating Committee, kind of supporting that resistance. So we'll be hearing from Lincoln Rice tonight, who's been the coordinator for the National War Tax Resistance Coordinating Committee since May 2018 and has been a war tax resistor since 1998. He has a bachelor's degree in accounting and earned his PhD in Christian ethics in 2017 from Marquette University. He's published in the areas of Black liberation, theology, and social ethics. So he'll be sharing about his journey and also some of the work of the National War Tax Resistance Coordinating Committee. We'll also be hearing from Carolyn Yoder, who's a psychotherapist specializing in individual and collective trauma and resilience. She is a mother and a grandmother living in Harrisonburg, Virginia, where she is directing a climate trauma action, resilience, and regeneration training program. She and her husband redirect and resist a portion of their federal income taxes each year. I guess also don't know about sharing a little bit about the War Industry Resistors Network, or if we go into.
Well, let me say a word, and then I'll just take a minute and say something about WIRN for everyone. Many of you have been at our webinars before, but just a reminder that, as Chrissy said, we do monthly webinars. This is our 30th. We've been at this for over 2 years. And you can find recordings of our webinars at our website, which I'll post the link to here in a minute. And I want to remind people, we mentioned already that we have another webinar in June. It's June 20th, and we'll have Jeremy Kuzmarov back again. We had him for our last webinar. This time he's going to discuss how the Clinton era has affected our foreign policy ever since his presidency. And his talk, and that one will be based on his newly released book titled Warmonger, how Clinton's malign foreign policy launched the U.S. trajectory from Bush to Biden. So I'm looking forward to that. That's June 20th. And lastly, in July, many of you may know that NATO is having a meeting in D.C., July 6th and 7th. And World Beyond War is going to have a conference and a day of action in Washington on the 6th and 7th to greet NATO, right? Mm-hmm. And I'll post the link to that event, to the World Beyond War event. And I also want to tell you that we're planning to have our July webinar be sort of a follow-up to that, and it will be on NATO. So we'll have more details on that later. And okay, so that's all I had to say. Thank you, Chrissy.
So I assume it's me you're looking to now. Okay. Hello, everyone. Good evening. I'm Carolyn Yoder, as Chrissy said, and I'm going to be talking for about 5 minutes, just giving some of my personal reasons, our personal reasons for why we do what we do. As a way of introduction and background, I grew up in a Mennonite community, and I'm still a member of that faith tradition. Mennonites, like the Quakers and the Church of the Brethren, are an historic peace church, meaning that we're conscientious objectors to war. And rather than serving in the military when there was a draft, we did what was called alternative service in places of humanitarian need, which is officially recognized by the government. So, for example, my husband, Rick, who's on this call tonight, worked in Palestinian refugee camps in Jordan, in the country of Jordan in the 1960s as his alternative service. But resisting payments of the portion of our taxes that go to war, that is not so much a Mennonite tradition. In fact, we kind of cynically say, we pray for peace, but we pay for war. Rick and I got married in 1975, and at that time, and probably some of you remember this, everyone's phone bill included a telephone tax to pay for the Vietnam War. We sent a letter to the IRS each month saying that we had redirected that amount to the Relief and Development Organization of our church, which was doing life-affirming work. And when that tax ended, it just seemed right, for many reasons, to withhold a symbolic portion of that federal income tax each year that went to military spending. So we usually withheld a couple $100, a symbolic amount. And we redirected it to organizations doing life-enhancing work in the US and abroad. There are many reasons that when that tax ended, we decided to continue redirecting or resisting. And one is that for 18 years, we were living and working in Asia, Africa, the Middle East, and the Caucasus doing development work. And we witnessed both the positive and negative effect of our tax dollars. But another reason is that it's all the devastation that war brings on so many levels, including, I believe, on our collective souls. And this is what I want to focus on in my comments this evening. My career was in psychosocial trauma healing, and it often involved dealing with the fallout of violent conflict. And my private psychotherapy practice brought veterans with PTSD and moral injury to my office. Moral injury, when we violate our own values in what we do or don't do, is much harder to work with than PTSD. Trauma is often compared to a process of fragmentation. It's an experience that's so overwhelming that one can't hold a coherent memory of what happened. And this can happen on a collective level too, when we do not hold a collective memory of what happened. Rather, they freeze inside us, and effective therapies can help unfreeze trauma, allowing the fragments to integrate. But with moral injury, the fragments stubbornly refuse, and the agony that people live with is heartbreaking. And so when I hear about war, whether it's between Russia and Ukraine or in the Sudan or Ethiopia or Israel-Palestine, I'm thinking about the innocent civilians, but I'm also thinking about what is happening to the soldiers who are fighting that war. Their lives will never be the same. And societies can suffer from moral injury too, whether we acknowledge it or not. In a recent article, Vietnam veteran and psychotherapist Patrick Doherty gives new language and insight into how to address moral injury in individuals and collectives. Doherty relates how when he was a young Marine, he nearly killed a Vietnamese mother and her infant in a rage after barging into her home when searching a village. Over the next 50 years, he was in therapy with 3 different skilled therapists, but it continued to haunt him. And a decade ago, he finally found a way forward when he joined an international study cohort on collective trauma. Doherty says, when we collectively experience something overwhelming, like the murder of George Floyd or the climate crisis or war, even in a faraway country, none of us individually can process it in real time. It fragments in us, and it also fragments in the collective unconscious or consciousness. He goes on, I had committed an immoral act in an immoral war And my therapist had avoided the collective aspect, leaving me individually carrying the weight of that moral wound that I believe should have been shared. My therapists were all older than I was, and they had been tax-paying citizens when I was in Vietnam. I believe that they hadn't been able to face the fact that they had helped pay for the gun I used, they had helped pay for my bullets and for my uniform. Doherty also realized that the therapy had done nothing to address the trauma he had caused to the Vietnamese woman and baby. So to acknowledge her, because he believes to acknowledge her in the therapy room would have required breaking through the collective defenses about the harm the U.S. inflicted on the Vietnamese people and the Iraqis and the Afghans and now people in the Middle East. Realizing this, Doherty decided to do something about it, and while meditating, he approached the woman across space and time and expressed his remorse. She responded in this meditation by shouting furiously at him. Then they sat and talked together in what he describes as a restorative justice-like conversation. Doherty found further healing when he told the whole story to a group from his collective trauma cohort. Healing from collective traumas, he says, requires collective acknowledgement and response. I believe that the atrocities such as are happening in Gaza, Israel right now, create a sense of moral injury in many of us. And that's probably why many of you are on the call tonight. Because when we violate our own values in what we do or don't do, or our country violates our values in what it does or doesn't do, it's too much for any of us to feel and lament alone. But when we come together, we unfreeze and find our voices. And that's why gatherings like this are so important. For the past 3 years in the Shenandoah Valley where I live, we've organized a gathering in a downtown park the Saturday before tax day in April. This year, about 35 people attended. It's a time of collective acknowledgement and lament. It's also a time of celebration because we present our pooled, redirected taxes and present checks to organizations such as Habitat for Humanity, humanitarian organizations working for peace in the Middle East, and other life-giving causes. So that's our collective response to collective atrocities. We're not under the illusion that we're going to change the system. What we give this year, about $6,000, is a pittance in the face of the U.S. military budget. But this small public collective action held next to our local farmers market helps us not to go numb amidst the warring madness. And I believe that's why we're here tonight.
Carolyn, thank you so much for sharing that in such a grounding way to talk about the motivations of war tax resistance and humanizing just the impact in such a real way. Somebody had asked about if you could name the author that you had mentioned in writing.
Yes, his name is Patrick Doherty, and he has a website. He works with collective trauma. He holds groups for veterans, and yeah, that's his emphasis.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. And I imagine we'll be taking questions a little bit later, but maybe I'll pass it off to Lincoln for now.
Thank you, Chrissy, and thank you, Carolyn. I think there's a reason why we're here talking about this tonight, and there's a reason that the National War Tax Resistance Committee Coordinating Committee has been around for a while, and it's all grounded in that reality of not wanting to directly participate in those things and redirect those funds to more life-giving causes. So going to be going through a slideshow that will probably take a little over 20 minutes, leaving us plenty of time for questions, comments, etc. So you might hear me refer to our organization as NWTRC. So NWTRC is kind of our acronym, NWTRCC, because otherwise National War Tax Resistance Coordinating Committee becomes quite a mouthful over and over again. So that's what we mean by that when I say that. So some important disclaimers. Some methods of tax resistance are not legal, and anyone who practices them should be prepared to face the risks of civil disobedience. The government's laws and policies are subject to change and may not in the future match what we're talking about with our historical experience. War tax resistance counselors such as myself, and we have a list that I'll be sharing a link to later, people by state who are war tax resistors who have taken some extra training to share their experiences with people and their knowledge so that people can make the best decision they want to make. We have a list of them by state that, again, I'll go through later, but we're not here to give tips on how to fudge, cheat, or employ gimmicks to reduce taxes or how to avoid taxes. Also, I'm oftentimes a person giving this discussion might say that they're not an accountant. As was pointed out earlier, my bachelor's is in accounting, but I am not a CPA. And truthfully, everything I'll be talking about tonight, I never learned in the classroom. In the classroom, we're learning about debits and credits and how to make financial statements and audits and how to do people's taxes, but it never came up. What if someone says, well, I'm not going to pay that? I wouldn't have known the answer. I learned all of that from talking to people at NWTRC and talking to people who have been war tax resistors for years. So I'm not really talking from that perspective tonight, but I'm not a financial advisor or a lawyer. So we really are going to be talking more about the experience of war tax resistors. So what the laws actually say when we get to consequences, but also what often happens. So just to give the example of jaywalking, jaywalking's against the law. You could technically be ticketed for it at any time, but it's usually something pretty rare to be ticketed for. And we'll give examples of regarding certain laws and circumstances that might be the case. So the National War Tax Resistance Coordinating Committee is a coalition of groups and individuals across the United States that we were founded in 1982, essentially to be a clearinghouse of information so that the War Tax Resistance group in Los Angeles wasn't unnecessarily duplicating the same type of info that the group in Chicago and New York and Boston and et cetera, et cetera. So we're around to kind of just be a resource for all those folks who have an interest in this topic. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on these particular slides. I'm sure most people here are probably already familiar with the fact that the United States spends more on its military and on militarism than any other country in the world. This is an annual pie chart put out by the War Resisters League, where they comb through the proposed budget of the president each year and look at how much is really going to be asked current military expenses to give a realistic pie chart. So we can see, since the end of World War II, usually the amount of the federal budget dedicated to past and current militarism has hovered between 40 and 50%. There are additional reasons why people resist. There's the military portion used in war, supplying weapons. People have also gotten involved because of border militarization, deportation, federal prisons, the militarization of the police. The tank there is through a government program that provides military-grade weapons and to local police departments. So that's a tank that at low cost was given to the Lakeland Police Department in Florida. The environment, the U.S. military is the #1 institutional user of oil in the world, and climate agreements like the Paris Climate Accords don't exempt military created emissions. So none of these very important climate accords actually cover the amount of pollution created by militaries. Torture and war crimes, and more recently the situation in Gaza, which has definitely led to, I would say, an explosion of, well, maybe that's not the right word, but it's just an extreme increase, an exponential increase in interest in war tax resistance. I'm definitely not going to go through all of these, but just to add a little bit more history to what Carolyn was talking about. It seems like if we have enough information about a society, we can find an instance of war tax resistance. One of the earliest recorded instances on what is now the United States goes back to the 17th century when an Algonquin tribe refused to pay taxes for a Dutch fort. More recently in Myanmar, sometimes known as Burma, they recently had a government military coup. The military is now running their country. And so starting in 2021, millions of people in Myanmar began refusing to pay their utility bills because it's a public utility. And it was one of the main ways that the military and / government are funded. So people since then have often, at least have had the risk of military with guns coming into their homes demanding this. And there's many instances of this happening. So there are people there kind of putting their lives on the line to try to defund the military government there. And so the United States, as we'll see, the risk is much lower. So one of the positives or negatives of war tax resistance, depending on one's perspective, is it can really be adapted for what your situation and what you're comfortable with. So on the negative end, that would mean people might call the office or email and just say, how do I do this? But it really depends on your situation and what level of risk you want to take, et cetera, et cetera. So, you know, that's kind of in a nutshell, the negative and positive, but hopefully, you know, if someone can take the time to beginning tonight, for instance, just kind of wading in the water of this type of resistance. It's not something to make a quick decision. We wouldn't recommend someone make a quick decision about it, but it's something to explore, see if this is right for you and how you'd want to apply this to your yearly living if it's going to be a long-term active resistance for you. But it is very flexible in how it can be done, and we'll be going through more of that this evening. So there, even though there's a lot of flexibility, you could say there's two umbrellas of how people do war tax resistance. So the first way is to refuse to pay some or all of the income taxes that you owe, and then you either file or do not file a tax return. So this would be no matter which, you know, whether you refuse to pay some or all of your federal income taxes, that's an illegal act. It is an act of civil disobedience, and we'll get to that again shortly. The only legal way to practice war tax resistance is to earn less than the taxable income amount, which for tax year 2024 is a little over $14,000 for a single individual, almost $29,000 for a married couple, etc. It's easy enough to find if you just Google standard deduction 2024, and that's the standard deduction for most people is their taxable income amount. If you're below it, you don't owe taxes. If you're above it, you might have other deductions or credits that actually zero out your tax debt, but that'd be something you'd need to look into more. So for some folks, also the earning less than the taxable income amount might coincide with wanting to leave a smaller carbon footprint, living a life of simplicity. So for some folks, those might go hand in hand with a commitment to dealing with the climate crisis, etc. So switching gears now to if you're an employee and you're in a situation where you have federal income taxes withheld from your paycheck, you know, it's often the thought, well, the taxes are withheld, there's nothing I can do about it. But oddly enough, we're one of the few countries where our government lets us tell our employer if we want money taken out of our paycheck or not. In many countries, especially in Canada and in Europe, for instance, withholding is set by their federal governments. They don't have an option to change that. But in the United States, usually when we're initially hired, if we're an employee or our first day of work, we'll be given this W-4 form, which we may have a faint memory of kind of just signing our name and turning it back in because it looks like a complicated tax form. But this is actually a form that can be refiled at any time. And we have I'm not going to go into the intricacies of this form because it doesn't apply to everyone. And it takes a little explanation to get into it. But we do have a resource on our website. You could also just Google NWTRC W4, or there's the web address if you put in newtric.org/W4, and I'll share that in the chat later. But there we have, for different learning styles, a one-page, two-sided flyer that's kind of the quick version that could get someone started if they wanted to redo their W4. We have a 10-minute video if you're more visual and audio oriented. And if you really want to know more of the details, there's a link on that page to a brief 8-page booklet. And I should note all of our resources that NWTRC creates are on our website and available for free. So people, if they want to order a paper copy, will essentially just charge them the cost of creating and shipping those types of items. But otherwise, if people are fine looking at their computer or phone, you can just browse our enormous website and find what you're looking for, hopefully. But Google can help with that also. So then when the time comes when you file your income taxes, getting back to the W-4, it can be up to you if you want to pay your federal income taxes. You might also be in a situation where you don't owe or you get a refund, and it would be perfectly legal to redo your W-4 so that at least you're not due a refund. Because otherwise, when you're giving the government when you get a refund, that in most instances implies that you've overpaid during the year and you've given the government a zero interest loan to do what it wants with that money. And then they give it to you. You know, the money that you pay in January, you might not get back to the following year in April. So these resources could also just help you file a legitimate W-4, because ideally the federal government has this form so that you are going to receive neither a refund nor owe federal income taxes. Technically, this is even just filling out this form, what we call inflating the W-4, if you will owe taxes. It is an illegal act. It's actually punishable. It's a criminal act that's punishable with up to a year in prison and a $100,000 fine. But this is one of those things where the IRS is not, at least since 1975, has not chosen to criminally charge any war tax resister who has done this. Early on, when this became a popular method during the end of the Vietnam War, some more prominent war tax resisters who were promoting this method did do about 9 months in prison, but it only seemed to raise awareness of the issue. So starting in 1975, we haven't seen anyone criminally charged or do any jail time, and the emphasis has been more on collection on the other end. But if you're self-employed, then none of that stuff with the W-4 applies. So if you're self-employed, you're either working as a contractor or a consultant. You may, depending if you're working for a company, doing work for a company as a self-employed person, they may have you fill out a W-9 when you start work with that client. Excuse me. And so essentially that just lets the person that you're doing contract work for, know where to send a 1099 NEC, non-employee income, non-employee compensation. Sorry, NEC stands for non-employee compensation, because if you make more than $600, they're supposed to report it. This doesn't come up, for instance, if you're, let's say, electrician and you do work for families. They're not required to file this 1099. They won't have you fill out a W-9, but this, depending on what type of self-employed work you do and who you do it for, you could end up having your income reported to the IRS. But in this instance, no matter what type of self-employment situation you're in, nothing is withheld from your paycheck, not even Medicare or Social Security. So you're responsible for paying all of that. So some people, depending on the type of work that they do, may try to work underneath the table, try to work for individuals or families that don't have 1099 reporting in order to keep their income invisible to the IRS and kind of float on by. Others, it's a lot. It's, as we'll get to later, it's more difficult for the IRS to collect from people who are self-employed, especially if they are switching who they do work for regularly. The gig economy has kind of thrown an additional wrench in this where, technically if you work for Uber, you're self-employed, or if you sell things on eBay, you're self-employed. And in those instances, eBay and Uber, for instance, are just acting as a place to connect people who are going to do the work from the customers, and then they handle the monetary transaction, take their cut, and pass the money on to you. So you're not actually working for eBay or Uber, but there's a special, what they call a 1099K form that is required for reporting when a third party holds money that was used in the making of income. So this actually happens now already with folks, even if you're self-employed and you do work for families, but you collect money on PayPal as not as a family or friend, but as income. That could be reported on a 1099K because it's income that's being held by a third party and then passed on to you. Oftentimes, for a lot of people, this wasn't reported because up until last tax year, in order for a 1099K form to go out, you needed to have at least $20,000 in income and at least 200 transactions. For our current tax year, they've lowered the reporting threshold to $5,000 of income, and starting in 2025, it'll drop to 600. So there could be folks who in the past thought they could be kind of not noticed by the IRS, who might show up on the IRS's radar as the reporting threshold for this type of income lowers. Filing versus not filing. So this is our graphic kind of here shows one is maybe you're a bit more seen, the other you're hiding perhaps a little bit. So why do some people file who are war tax resistors and others not? So there can be positives and negatives for each, or part of it could depend on one's philosophy. But if you file, you're sending an accurate tax form. It allows you to send a letter of protest if you would like to do that. So that's a common thing that many war tax resistors like to do, especially if they paper file. It does make IRS collection easier because before the IRS can actually start collecting or start its collection process, it has to assess that you actually owe a tax debt. So if you're not filing, they have to file on your behalf. It's another step that they may or may not get to. So again, filing gets rid of one step for the IRS. They already know how much you owe. One advantage, one thing that's often viewed as an advantage for many folks who file is once your tax debt is assessed by the IRS, it begins a 10-year statute of limitations. So the IRS has 10 years to collect, or in very rare instances, charge someone criminally. But after that 10 years has expired, they can no longer go after that tax debt or charge someone criminally. The one exception would be if you filed what I'd call a fraudulent return, if you took deductions that you were not supposed to take, or if you understated your income. There is like a margin of error that they realize someone maybe made a mistake, but there are times where it's obvious that this was intentional. And in these instances, in the last 25 plus years, it's been almost exclusively those people who have intentionally filed fraudulent, misleading tax forms that the IRS has used its limited resources to criminally charge. Otherwise, it's usually been the collection arm of the IRS. With filing, it also makes it easier to apply for scholarships and health insurance subsidies. So for instance, you don't actually have to be up to date on having paid your taxes to qualify for student loans. federally subsidized student loans, but the FAFSA often likes to verify your income that you qualify for student loans by looking at what forms you filed with the IRS. It's not a requirement, but depending on who's working on a particular case, they may or may not have flexibility and looking at other avenues to verify income. Health insurance subsidies with Obamacare, if someone is receiving insurance through that, subsidies through that method, in order to qualify for those subsidies, you have to file, and you have to file married jointly. So for some folks where maybe they wanted to have a spouse file separately and kind of shield perhaps some risk, if you want to receive Obamacare, it makes you file together. Switching over to not filing. So this is where you do not send forms to the IRS. We'd still recommend that you always fill out your forms. Please, if you decide not to file, don't do it just because it's easier. Fill out your forms anyways, keep your records, because if the IRS does file on your behalf in the future and you are collectible and they can start taking funds from you in some capacity, they're never going to file a tax return that's favorable to you. They're always going to overestimate how much you owe. And so you could end up paying a lot more if you don't have a way to dispute the tax form that they file for you. It does make IRS collection harder. As I said, they have to file the tax return on your behalf. That takes a lot of resources. So they often don't get around to that. In essence, there's no statute of limitations for collection, but again, it'll start once they file for you, which could happen shortly. It could happen never. It could happen 10 years down the road. It's hard to say. And there is an additional financial penalty which would come into play if someone begins being collected upon. So as we kind of shift into another gear here, I'm going to talk about some myths of war tax resistance, then what actually does happen, and end with sharing some resources. So it's definitely built into the American psyche that if you don't pay your taxes, you're going to go to jail. And so very few war tax resistors have gone to jail in modern times. And recently, I share here, there's the instance of Tony Serra, who was a lawyer. He's actually the only war tax resistor in the last 25 years plus who was criminally charged and did prison time, who wasn't lying on his tax forms. And I think part of that was they wanted to make a special case of him. He's an activist lawyer in the Bay Area. And so and they could more easily prove that he understood from a legal perspective exactly what he was doing. So I would make a caveat that if someone is a lawyer, you may want to, the risk could be greater and you'd want to consider, take that in consideration. But otherwise, it's very rare. The IRS will take my house, car, or property. If this was if I was giving this talk in 1994, I would actually say this isn't a myth. This could have, especially with cars. Cars were very commonly seized from war tax resistors. Houses less common, but it happened. If you were a war tax resistor during that time, you probably know someone who had their house seized or know of someone. But the IRS had a change in policy. None of the laws changed, but they had a change in policy about how aggressive they were with taking property. And so we can see by this chart, which is from the information that we took from the IRS's website, that prior to the mid to late 90s, they were often taking 10,000 plus pieces of property a year. Since then, it's usually on a yearly basis been between 50 and 400 pieces of property. And in the last, since the late 90s, we don't know of any war tax resistor who's had any piece of property seized at all. It seems to be something that they save for the very rich as a way to kind of push them into making payments. Another myth, the IRS will just end up getting more money in the end. They'll always get the money. This is from the IRS's this is a graph, a graphic that the IRS published not too long ago, essentially stating that in any given year, the gross tax gap is near $500 billion. And so the gross tax gap is their term to say, to explain how much the difference between how much they believe the government should be paid in a given year minus the amount the government actually gets paid in taxes in a given year. So essentially they believe that every year, and this number has increased since then, but they haven't put out a totally new graphic. So this is a few years old, but a few years ago, they'd say that in a given year, $458 billion isn't paid. And by their looking at the historical success of collection, they believe that at the end of the day, when all is said and done, of that $458 billion, they'll collect about $52 billion, meaning that for any given tax year, for all the unpaid tax debt, they believe they'll collect around 13%. So unfortunately, we will get to collection shortly. It is something that happens, but again, it's rare and it's often the unlucky few. So it does happen, but it's not the norm at this moment. War tax resistors don't pay for things our society needs. So to emphasize, as Carolyn pointed out, it's a common practice of war tax resistors, especially those who are refusing to pay some or all of their taxes, to redirect those to especially local groups and organizations, sometimes national peace groups, etc. Kind of leave that up to the individual person or family. And sometimes there are groups that do that collectively. As Carolyn noted, locally they do that. One of the larger groups that does this in the Bay Area is the Northern California People's Life Fund. And I believe this past year they had a granting ceremony where they have all the people come together, share what work they're doing locally, and they redirected around over $60,000. So again, for the IRS, that's not much, to be honest. But we know that for all of the groups that are receiving these funds, it's a whole lot. So it's very meaningful, and it shows how even just a little bit of money being redirected can be very helpful and life-giving. So what are the actual risks? Letters, especially if you're a filer, you'll get lots of letters. And the first letter, every letter, even I've been a war tax resistor since 1998, and every time I get a letter, which is a few times a year, my heart still skips a beat. I'm like, uh-oh. But usually it's almost always a computer-generated letter. They love to send letters because they know that 50% of tax debt that's overdue that they do collect, people send that in just because they receive a letter, and it's just so frightening. So there's the letters, salary or Social Security garnishments. Social Security garnishments are actually pretty common. So if you have a tax debt and start collecting Social Security, probably at some point they might start collecting on that, and they can take 15% of someone's Social Security. If you're working somewhere, they might start a garnishment there. There it's based on, they need to leave you an amount to take home. So if you're a single individual, it's a little over $1,200 a month take home. If you're married, it's almost $2,500 a month. And if you have kids, it goes up. So depending on what size your income is, it might either be a very small or a very large adjustment. If you're self-employed, it's actually similar to the next one below, a bank account seizure. With a bank account seizure, again, these are also very rare. All of these, other than the letters and the Social Security garnishments, are very rare. I often refer to it as the reverse lottery. Like, there are people who get chosen, but it's not the majority at this time. But if a bank account was seized, they could take everything in the bank account up to the amount that's owed. And it's similar if you're self-employed, that if you're owed money when the person that you're doing contract work for receives the letter, any money that you're owed when they open that letter is supposed to be given to the IRS up to the amount of the tax debt owed. But with both a bank account seizure and a self-employed levy, it only counts for the day that they receive it. It doesn't continue on. A salary levy and a Social Security levy will continue on until the debt's paid or the 10 years expires. but the bank, that's the difference between the bank levy and self-employed people. If they want to try to collect again in the future, they need to send another letter over and over again, and that's a lot of time and effort by the IRS. They do collect state refunds from time to time if someone overpays. There are interest and penalties. A good rule of thumb is that interest and penalties will double your tax debt over the course of 10 years. So if you filed, if you decide like, I just want to, maybe you owe $5,000, but you just want to get your feet wet this coming year, and so you refuse to pay $300. After 10 years, that $300 will probably turn into about $600 before the debt expires. We talked about the possible loss of health insurance subsidies for those who don't file, difficulty in getting student loans. Once someone owes around $20,000, they may file a public notice of public lien with a local county courthouse. The main effect that that would have is if you were a homeowner and you were selling your home, since that's a transaction that goes through a county courthouse. The bank or credit union or whoever's handling the loan for the buyer would see that the IRS has this publicly filed, and they'd get their cut first. Sometimes when the IRS does this, they also may send a note to some of the credit reporting agencies, but in the last almost 10, probably 8 or 9 years now, I'm not aware of anyone who's had their credit affected by this. I have a notice of a public lien that went into effect in 2018, but my credit's still fantastic. So, and then the last thing, for the way Zoom is, I can't see the amount. I think it's 62,000. Whatever the screen says, Zoom's blocking it out for me. But if you have what the IRS considers an extremely delinquent tax debt, or essentially it goes up from year to year. When this law went into effect in 2018, it was $50,000, and then it goes up with inflation. But if you hit this amount, which will again go up next year, the IRS won't allow you to renew or obtain a new passport. If you have a passport, you can continue using it until it expires. So for folks who either love to travel or need to travel for work, it'd be something to keep in mind. You might want to make sure that your tax debt remains below that number. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this slide. We're right near the end here, but some of you may recall early on in the Biden administration, there was a bill that provided $80 billion to the IRS over 10 years, which over the course of 10 years would double their workforce and bring their funding back to about where it was 10 years ago. 10 years ago, they really weren't that effective either. They're just even so much worse now. So if this actually ends up happening, it'll largely depend on who's elected president next. If this funding continues or gets cut, it's already been cut a number of times when there have been deals between Congress and President Biden to raise the debt ceiling. So we'll see what happens there. But even if they were given this money, when it comes to collection, it'd probably just mean that there'd be a few more bank levies and a few more wage levies that happen, but probably not that many more. So lastly, or almost lastly, as I mentioned, all of our resources are available for free. We have a newsletter that goes out every 2 months, a blog that comes out every 1 or 2 weeks, lists of tax day activities, gatherings, workshops. So there's a lot of stuff on our website. Feel free to check it out, browse around. And then I'll put this in the chat in a moment, but just a resource list, our website, the W-4 form, the W-4 website that has everything about the W-4 form, the counselor list that I talked about earlier, which lists war tax resistance counselors who are just war tax resistors willing to take a deeper dive with anyone who wants to talk about it. We have them organized by state. Sign up for our newsletter to receive the version of it. And then lastly, there's the War Tax Resistance Penalty Fund. We host them on our website. They're technically a separate group, but when someone is collected upon, they're essentially a mutual aid society who will pass the hat to reimburse folks at least for the interest and penalties. So not the principal amount, but again, if you're someone who had resisted $10,000 and it, maybe they caught it halfway in and collected 15 from you because 5,000 was interest and penalties. As long as you just show them the paperwork that you've received for that, and they'll pass the hat. And they haven't been very active lately because there's been so little collection. But in the past, they might send out a request every like 3 or 4 times a year and ask folks to pitch in 25, $30. And for the most part, they were able to reimburse almost everybody, everything that they had taken in interest and penalties. So if you want to check out their website, there's a sign up there if you're interested in supporting war tax resistance in that way. So I just put that in the chat. But yeah, thank you. I'll pause there.
Great. Thank you so much, Lincoln, for all of that information. Quite informative. And yeah, just kind of maybe taking a pause to let people just, let that settle. And thanks to you and Carolyn both for sharing of your experience. And kind of wanted to maybe mention a couple of questions that came up in the chat. And I think you kind of got to one in the last one, but how is the new IRS proposal change going to affect NWTRC? Oh, you're muted.
Do they mean the $80 billion, or I don't know what they mean by IRS change?
Yeah, and it kind of came early on, but hopefully I would think that it was related maybe to with the influx of new funding to the IRS. And yeah, maybe even for myself to speak as NWTRC, that the work continues as it is, but you could say more. Or maybe moving on to another question, is it wise to donate to charities to lower your tax bracket, and how?
I mean, there can be different ways, for some folks, it could be donating or not. It could be even putting in their own retirement, different, I don't want to get into all the different ways to put into your retirement. If you're still, saving for retirement or thinking of saving for retirement, that's often an easy way to lower someone's tax debt. Donating is hard because donations, as I recall, granted, so I don't do tax forms anymore. It's not my specialty, but as I recall, you'll get for every $100 you donate to a tax exempt charity, it lowers your taxable income by $50. So it's like a 50% amount that you get, but it's only on Schedule A. So Schedule A is the schedule that people use if they're not taking the standard deduction. And so most of the time, people only don't take the standard deduction and use Schedule A if they're also paying off a home loan, because interest on a home loan can be deducted on Schedule A. But again, that interest has to be so much that it's greater than the standard deduction of about $14,000 for an individual and $28,000 for a married couple. So if you're not paying off your home, most people aren't filing Schedule A, which means anything you donate, you can't deduct on your taxes at all. It's different if you're self-employed. You could perhaps sponsor a little league team, and you could take that as an advertising expense and lower your taxable income. So it kind of depends on your situation.
Maybe I'll ask another specific question that came up in the chat, and that maybe if wanted to maybe mention some other resources that kind of get into some of the specifics on the website to direct people to. But there was a question about the 10-year statute of limitations for the 62,000 debt. At which point do you lose your passport?
Yeah, so when you, now that I'm not in the one mode of Zoom, I can just, okay, so yeah, loss of passport for debts over $62,000. But again, that's just the ability to renew your passport or get a new one. If you have one, you can continue using it. And if you did reach that amount and needed to travel, if you started a payment plan with the IRS, they would allow you to get your passport back. But if you stopped paying, that's the only instance where they've revoked passports, is when someone signed a payment plan in order to renew it or get a new one and then stopped paying. Then they're like, well, if you're going to stop paying, we're not going to allow you to have your passport anymore. But it's right now it's $62,000. Next year, it'll probably be like $64,000. So it'll keep going up.
Great. I know that you included some resources in the chat links that have the NWTRC YouTube video that has some introductions to 101 and the W4 that you also mentioned. I guess there's also a question for Carolyn from Cynthia Piepermaster. Not sure she's able to unmute herself, or if it's possible to unmute Cynthia.
Thank you, Chrissy. Thank you so much, Lincoln. Carolyn, what you were saying about our collective moral injury really resonated with me, because I'm finding that that's my situation, and the situation with so many activists that I work with here in the Bay Area, is that we are suffering a kind of collective trauma watching the genocide unfold and feeling powerless. And I just wondered if you could share any words with me about what we could do. You may have said some things before, but I would love it if you would maybe give us something, something we could do, or to either to.
I think, yes, I agree. I think we often don't name it. We know we're feeling terrible about what's happening, but we don't often name it as actually a collective trauma or actually moral injury, because we're witnessing and we're feeling a part of this government, and that our taxes are helping to pay for this. Again, I go back to Patrick Doherty's words: the best thing we can do for our collective trauma is we need a collective response. And so things like this, actually, where we, not as only an individual, but we're part of a group that is doing something, we don't feel so alone. One of the things that happened in our denomination, the Mennonite denomination, fairly early on when the war started with Gaza and Israel, was there was a group put together called Mennonite Action. And the outpouring of money to that group and people power was really amazing. And I think it's because trauma is an energy, and that energy has to go somewhere. And so being able to put our efforts, our angst into something positive is what we need at times like this. And even though we may not be affected in the way we want to be, it's much better than just individually feeling that angst and worry. We're stronger together, as you know.
Thank you. Thanks so much.
I know that there were some also clarifying questions about the 10-year statute of limitations. I'm not sure if you had a chance to see that, Lincoln.
No, but
the question was if the debt accumulates beyond 10 years, or if the debt incurred in the 10-year statute of limitation expires.
Yeah, so after 10, once again, as long as we're clear that the 10-year statute of limitations begins once your debt is assessed, for most people, that's when their tax return is processed by the IRS, that after 10 years, their tax debt no longer increases, it goes to zero. As long as they filed an accurate form, there's, the issue is completely done. They can't do anything about it in any way. The tax debt is zero. And for instance, if they had filed a public lien against a notice of a public lien at a local county courthouse. I mean, there still might be a lien for tax debt that's less than 10 years old, but anything that from that 10 years plus is no longer part of that lien anymore.
And also interesting clarification on the 10-year statute. Does that also limit how long Social Security can be garnished?
There was actually a court ruling recently. So it used to be, let's say that the IRS was, I'll use the wage garnishment example first. If they were garnishing your wages from a tax debt that was assessed in 2015, in April of 2015, once we hit April of 2025, even if there was more tax debt still owed, they couldn't garnish anymore. There'd be a stop to collecting for that year. That used to be how they understood Social Security collection, but the IRS wanted to interpret that law differently, and it went to court and they won. This is within the last year. So the thought was, if let's say use the same example, you have a tax debt from 2015 and they're currently collecting on Social Security. Normally, if it was a wage levy, once April of 2025 came, they couldn't collect for that year anymore. But with Social Security, as long as they put in for that garnishment on your Social Security, they can finish collecting for that year for however long it takes. The difference is that the legal difference, as they explain, is while you're working, you're making money for each pay period that you work. But when you're collecting Social Security, you're actually getting a benefit of something that you earned from years ago. And so because you're, in one sense, are already owed it, they can keep collecting on it. So it's the one way that they've figured out to circumvent the statute of limitations. But I will mention, with both wage garnishments and Social Security levies, which are rare, it's very common for them to only levy or garnish wages for like 1 or 2 years at a time. Even if you owe for, let's say, 10, they won't put in for all 10. They'll just put in for 1 or 2. And when that expires, like, people notice the levy and the garnishment will stop, sometimes for up to a year, before they finally put in another levy for another year. And in that time, there could have been a year that expired. So again, it's very hodgepodge how the IRS works. They're not extremely organized.
Great. I see that Jeffrey Burkdale has a question. If Jeffrey, if you're able to unmute yourself.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
One question for you, Lincoln, and the other for Carolyn. For you, Lincoln, does or can the president control where our money goes or not? And for you, Carolyn, that was a sad story, but what you told, that I mentioned about having hypnotherapy be a solution, another solution for helping those get over the trauma and all that stuff that they experienced back then, you know? Should that be added into the what you call it, the therapy sessions and all that? Okay, you can answer the questions.
Sure. Thank you so much. That's one of those. I'll give a very brief answer because it's not my specialty. Obviously, there are some things that the president can control. I mean, we saw this. I mean, I feel like it was especially highlighted during the Trump administration when he wanted to be spending money on the wall, and he could a little bit because he could redirect some things because it was already in the, some things he could say, well, it's kind of in the budget that I could bend what it's meant for and use it for the wall, but he couldn't get the full money he wanted. And so it's definitely a dance between the president and Congress. I mean, obviously they agree on spending things like Social Security. There's a previous agreement that if they don't come up with a new one, certain things are kind of have been pre-agreed upon by previous administrations. So it's a real mix, but generally I'd say it's Congress who makes the Congress then signed by the president. I mean, that's how it's supposed to work ideally, but I'll stop there.
And on the question of hypnotherapy, I don't actually know what the research is on the efficacy of that for post-traumatic stress disorder or for moral injury. What I do know is things that we know are effective are the eye movement desensitization and reprocessing, the tapping on acupoints, EFT, there's a lot of research on that, internal family systems, and somatic experiencing. Trauma requires not just working with the mind, but also working with the body. So any treatment for trauma that's relying only on the mind will be able to be helpful, but only to a certain extent. You have to also involve the body. So I would imagine that it's at a certain phase, hypnotherapy could be effective, but I don't know for sure.
There's another question for Lincoln. Can you briefly summarize any interesting tax resistance campaigns happening in addition to the NWTRC? I started tax refusal or tax boycott campaign that's kind of like an opinion poll that includes the threat of not paying taxes to show our financial health.
Sure. Let me put something in the chat. It would bring you to an article from our February-March newsletter where we highlighted two groups. One's called We the People, and there is a We the People that's like a group, a long-term group that's been around that says taxes aren't legal according to the Constitution. NWTRC does not profess that, and that's not the group mentioned in this. They're a newer group. The group that we talk about in the article is a newer group. There's also a group called the Tax Resistance Collective. And so both of these groups, the people who founded them contacted NWTRC shortly after the invasion of Gaza because they were very concerned about it and wanted in a more direct way to oppose it, such as refusing funds for it. And both of them have war tax resistance campaigns currently going on. So in that article, there's also they're definitely, it's organized by younger folks, or at least younger than what we might often imagine in the peace movement, and they're very active on Instagram. So in that article, there's links to their Instagram accounts and how to get in touch with them if people want to explore those groups more.
There's also a question for you, Carolyn, about thanking you, and how do you balance the biblical teaching against praying loudly in public, proudly proclaiming one's tax resistance, and the fact that people are encouraged and inspired when we see what others are doing?
Well, I don't see what we're doing when we have our little ceremony each year as proudly proclaiming, because we're very aware of how small we are in the midst of the huge amount of expenditures. So I see it more just as a public witness. Again, it's important that I think that our acts are not just private, no one knows about it, but we are trying to make others aware that there's an option. And a lot of people don't know there's an option. So that's part of the purpose of it. And also, again, just the collective, being part of a group of people that's doing this.
Thank you. There was another one for you, again, thanking you. And they commented, I have worked with many individuals diagnosed with PTSD and who have experienced early childhood developmental trauma, not heard the term collective trauma before. Could you point us to any resources to learn more?
Yeah, the best resource in terms of war is the website that I put in of Patrick Doherty. I put that website in, I can put it in again. The other person that works with collective trauma and has a couple books out on it is Thomas Hubel. He's Austrian, Hubl, I think his name is. And he's a good resource. He does a lot of online training.
I see Paul Shannon, you have your hand up?
Yeah, I have a couple of quick questions for Lincoln. It's been a long time since I've done the telephone tax resistance. And now when you get a phone bill, whether it's a landline or a cell phone, there are so many fees at the end of your bill. I'm wondering, are any federal taxes collected on these telephone bills we get these days?
For most people, no. I'll put it in the chat. This will not apply to most people. But we still have an active website about what we call our Hang Up on War campaign. But essentially, with cell phones, it's mostly eclipsed because the federal excise tax, that was that tax that many people resisted, it only applies to phone plans where there's a separate local and a separate long distance plan. So cell phones, it's usually a combined thing. You don't get your bill and see it's either unlimited or, there's no separate local and long distance. And even I know I do still have a landline, and I got sick of dealing with the phone company because I never understood that they weren't supposed to disconnect me over it. But if you do have a landline, you could just combine I had initially had working assets, a different, a better long distance phone company as my long distance service. But I must admit, I just had it all under the local company that I was dealing with. I just used an integrated plan that included unlimited local and long distance. And then it disappeared from my bill. So for most people, it doesn't apply.
Okay, so telephone tax resistance is really not the option that it used to be.
That's right, definitely.
Now, if you pay less, you make out your form and you pay less than is due. The only way you can do that really is to add dependents to your W-4 form, I think. And I mean, that could carry its own penalties. But what happens is that they start to keep track of how much you owe each year. And there is a percentage fee, a charge for not having paid, right? So, and that total starts to really build up. And as you get notices about how much you owe, and you see that along with the interest you're paying, the government eventually is going to get far more than they would have gotten originally. At least that's the way it looks. Am I reading that correct? After 3 or 4 years, that can build up with those interest charges to a lot.
Well, I'll start with the W-4. During the Trump administration in 2020, it was totally revamped. So now you're just supposed to put down legally, you're supposed to put down anticipated deductions. So, if you have interest on your, like student loan interest, let's say, and you expect student loan interest of $12,000 you're paying that year, that's something that gets included in the deductions line. And so if you want to inflate your W-4 so that you don't have anything taken out, depending on how much you make, you might be putting $25,000 or $50,000 in that line. So it's very different than before, where you're putting a 1 or a 5 or a 6. And each of those numbers you put in might represent children, or they might represent deductible healthcare expenses for the year. In one sense, I think they really simplified it, but for people who are used to the old method, it can be difficult. But anyway, that's why we have that website, nutric.org/W4, goes through the new form. And yeah, when it comes to if you have a tax debt that you're not paying, penalties and interest over 10 years, your tax debt will double. But as I noted during the presentation, according to the IRS's own numbers, for any given tax year, for everything that's not paid to them, they anticipate they'll collect about 13% of the tax debt. So they're very upfront that over 85% of all undue taxes for a given year, they don't believe they'll ever collect.
Thanks.
Lincoln, I know you mentioned it earlier, but somebody had made mention about putting money into an alternative fund, or was a peace tax fund, and I didn't know about seeing anything more. Just Carolyn also talked about, yeah, redirecting resources into our communities. I feel like that's such an integral part of the tax resistance. That it's not withholding taxes or trying to, to not share resources with our community, but if either of you wanted to speak to that.
Or I can start. I just put in the chat, there's a link to our website where it really, unfortunately, it lists 3, but it's really the one that's in the New England area and the Bay Area are the 2 really active ones that are still going. During the 80s, there used to be like dozens of these groups. So they unfortunately, there's also at the end, if someone's interested in starting an alternative fund, there's a link to get started with that. But essentially, these are places that either pool, each one's different, they're not connected to NWTRC. They're usually local people or from a region, and they're pooling money together to redirect somewhere. Or in some instances, they may also be a place that if someone doesn't want to redirect the money right away, let's say they're resisting $2,000 this year, they could put the $2,000 there, kind of let it sit there safely for the 10 years until the 10-year statute of limitations expires, and then have the group donate it. Or if they were in the unlucky instance of being collected upon, they could use it to reimburse themselves. So yeah, if people are interested in that, I'd say check out those 2 groups, contact them. They're always looking for new members.
I would add that we always include letters with our tax return to the IRS, but we also send a copy of that to the president, to our senators, to our congressperson. And we explain what we're doing, and we also explain that we are not against paying taxes, but we just want our taxes to go for life-enhancing things and making people's lives better. And when we redirect our taxes to, like we did to a group that works in Palestine this year, we also include a letter to them explaining what we're doing. So in a way, it's another way of just getting the word out, even to the organizations we're redirecting the money to.
Maybe I'll maybe just add, I noticed, I was kind of browsing the chat a little bit, but I noticed someone talking about a letter if you've filed electronically. And that's why a lot of people paper file, because it's easy to send a letter. It also takes a lot more resources for the IRS to process your tax return. It takes them less than 1 second to process an electronic tax return. It takes them a lot more people power to process a paper tax return. But the only way to send a letter that would be associated with your account and maybe become part of your account if you're electronically filing is if you're actually paying something. Because if you file electronically, the IRS is only expecting to be mailed a payment if you decide to mail a payment. If you're not mailing a payment, if you tried to send it, they'd see that you're not supposed to be sending it and they just throw it away immediately. But I think, as Carolyn pointed out, even if you were in that instance of electronic filing, you could still, try to get your letter published in a local newspaper, send it to your Congress people. You could send it to the IRS commissioner if you wanted to also. So there are other avenues to make it more public if you wanted.
Yeah, and kind of incorporating what you were saying, Carolyn, the person commenting, saying that they had pursued that method, but it was an opportunity to have conversations with their community, family members. And, I think NWTRC has seen a huge increase in war tax resistance since October 7th, with people becoming aware that people are resisting taxes in this way. And so I think the motivation or the creation of NWTRC to share this information, but also to create community and to strengthen people having courage to take this action, and also, that it is a spectrum of actions that people take. It's as you both have indicated this evening that it's not one size fits all, and and it's part of a journey and a progression. And I just want to say thank you, and also to thank the War Industry Resistors Network of hosting this webinar to share this information. As it was said, half of our federal income taxes go towards militarism, and as we've learned in recent years, half of that money is going directly to weapons manufacturers. So I really want to thank the War Industry Resistors Network for making this connection with our tax monies, continuing to put pressure onto these profiteers of so much harm. And I really thank you, Carolyn, for rooting us to begin this evening in terms of not getting lost in just the news, but the human impact, and to kind of pull us together to like feel that and to feel that or recognize that moral injury, and that we can be with it together and find ways that we can lessen that harm for all the people the world over. So know that we're kind of coming to a close with time, and I didn't know if either of you wanted to share some final thoughts.
I just was thinking as you were talking, Chrissy, that events like this are very uplifting for me. One of the things that it's important to feel support and that you're not in this alone. One of the things that really was encouraging to Rick and me over the years is that I think it was in 1987, our local congregation took an action that they would support anyone in the congregation that wanted to do war tax resistance or redirection. They would have our backs financially, they would have our backs morally, and that feels wonderful. And so just looking into the faces of people who are here tonight is really beautiful. So thank you.
Thanks. And Alman, I noticed just browsing the chat, one of the questions that popped out was how many, which almost always gets asked, how many war tax resistors are there? And unfortunately, I don't have any idea really, because so many people, there are people like Carolyn and Chrissy and myself, and a lot of folks with NWTRCC more public, but a lot of folks are trying to maybe, for whatever reason, trying to keep that more private. What we can say is that previous to the invasion of Gaza, it was like clockwork. Every year when it came to our web stats, basically every year we would have 40,000 unique IP addresses or unique individuals visit our website, 40,000. And on average, each one of them looked at 9 pages on our website. And so just think of the last time you went to a website and did you look at 9 pages on that website? So it means people are doing serious research while they're there. Since the invasion of Gaza, we have averaged 20,000 unique visitors each month. So again, it had been 40,000 a year. Now, what we used to get in half a year, 20,000, are visiting every single month. And the number of looking at 9 pages on average on our website has stayed consistent. It's also been a lot of younger people that have been interested. We haven't seen as much growth on Twitter or Facebook. That there's been some growth, but minor. But on places like TikTok, where we started a page with some intro videos on war tax resistance, and on Instagram, which have a much younger with their audience. So Instagram, for instance, I'll end with this. We in September of 2024, we had about 500 or 600 followers. Now we have over 20,000. So we've just seen a huge explosion of interest there, and that's how most newer folks who are younger are getting information about war tax resistance.
Again, thank you both, Carolyn and Lincoln, for being here and sharing information about war tax resistance. And I don't know if there's any announcements about the next events. I know Ken mentioned any earlier. And Paul, I see you're unmuted. Do you have any final words?
Well, it's just great to see people still interested in this topic. It goes way back. It certainly is a direct way of confronting the war industry. And so I appreciate the speakers giving us the latest ways of doing this and giving us this comprehensive picture. We really haven't had that in a long time.
Well, thanks to MAPPA for your role in hosting this as well. Yes.
Thank you, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. Have a good evening.
Night.
Good night.